What a weekend. I had intended to unplug and succeeded somewhat. But you blink these days and the change is beyond extreme. After more than 50 years of despotic rule by the al-Assad family in Syria, the regime was toppled at some point on Saturday morning or afternoon. It is clear that even President Bashar al-Assad was shocked by how quickly things went down, as were the Russian forces in the country. Major Russian air and military bases were being evacuated in a panic. There was and remains much mystery around the movement of President al-Assad and members of his family in top leadership. He is reported to have sought sanctuary in Moscow, where President Putin welcomed him, on humanitarian grounds, for now. Family members are also reported to have accompanied him. Exactly who is with him is not yet known. When and how they were evacuated remains unclear. Assad's prime minister was led from a building, either his residence or office, surrounded by a phalanx of armed rebels. He was reportedly taken to the Damascus Four Seasons. As he was being escorted, the prime minister was speaking on his cell phone, uninterrupted and physically unrestrained, but clearly not free to walk about wherever he chose. He also appeared to be unscathed physically. We have a clip of that event in the podcast notes. This is all somewhat arresting, no bad pun intended, because typically events like this, regime overthrow, particularly in the Middle East, come with scenes of violence and gore. As Katz remarks in our discussion, which you will soon hear, it seems that this coalition of rebels may have been tutored in brand and media management. For real. Exhibit A? See the clip in the podcast notes of a man speaking to the world from the Syrian Radio and Television Central Broadcasting Facility. He is clean-shaven, speaks appropriately, and tells the world that the Assad regime has been overthrown. This was the first face of the new regime that the world saw. But this is the Middle East, and the situation is beyond complex. And so I'll cut to the discussion with a State of Tel Aviv regular and favorite, Katz, journalist, author, analyst par excellence, and always enlightening to engage with him. As Yaakov and I have pledged to do at the end of each podcast, we finish off with a discussion of the fate of the 100 hostages still held by Hamas in brutal conditions. On Saturday afternoon, Hamas released another 3-minute video, this time of 25-year-old hostage Matan Zangaukar. His physical condition is clearly dire. Since his capture, when he was jammed between two Hamas terrorists on a motorcycle and spirited into Gaza, it is believed that Matan has existed in a tunnel. His mother, Einav, has been a fierce advocate for her son. She has also been a thorn in the side of police and political leadership because she is unrelenting and unapologetic and will do almost anything to shine the spotlight on the plight of the hostages. The video of Matan was the first sign of life that Einav Zangaukar has had of her son since October 7th, 2023. Her agony is unimaginable. We have provided a link to the Hamas video of Matan Zangaukar in the podcast notes. Yaakov and I discuss what are early signs of what is partly the Trump effect, we think, and partly the rather desperate circumstances of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But there are significant signs that there may be real momentum towards a deal that will release all Israeli and Thai hostages that remain in the hands of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other terrorist operatives in the Gaza Strip. We get into it all. One thing I think everyone living in this region can agree on: there's never a dull moment. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and today, enjoying the tranquility and unimaginably perfect winter weather in the western Negev desert, while chaos swirls around me. Stay with us.
Monday, December 9th, 11:20 in Israel. Good morning to you, Yaakov. How are you?
Good morning, Vivian.
And how are you today?
How am I today? I think like most days, concerned but optimistic.
I'm feeling the same way. There's a bit of a shift in the vibe. Maybe you can only kind of, live with total bleakness for so long, but it does feel like something is shifting and lifting. And the big thing this week, of course, is all eyes on Syria. Extraordinary what happened from one weekend to the next to our northern neighbor. Last weekend, there was suddenly this major push by the so-called rebels, which is led by HTS, who I've been reading a lot about in the last week. But in any event, we all watched, I was stunned as they literally surged through Syria and during the course of Saturday took control of the nerve center, Damascus. And we all saw the images of Damascus falling, literally all of the statues of the al-Assad family leaders from the last 50 years, touring through the presidential palaces in their incredible displays of luxury cars, ransacking the embassy of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and on. But let's get into what this really means for now and for the near future. So tell us about HTS and the leader. And then, if you wouldn't mind, just expand to the other groups that are just kind of referred to as rebels. It's a lot more complicated than rebels, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, rebels is a nice kind of catchphrase that includes pretty much everybody who's been involved here. And you have two primary groups, right? You do have two different kind of, I would say, rebel groups, but HTS is the dominant one, and they've really been the group that has barreled down throughout Syria over the last week or so and had this mesmerizing success. HTS stands for Ha'yat Tahrir al Sham. It's a known group because they used to be affiliated, or they used to be in their prior name. They were called the Nusra Front, the Jabhat al-Nusra. That's the group. We knew them back in the days of the first iteration of the Syrian civil war, when in 2011, 12, 13, they were fighting. There was, of course, the rise of ISIS. These rebels is what brought the Iranians into Syria. It's what brought the Russians into Syria. So the Jabhat al-Nusra was a very dominant and powerful rebel faction that was fighting inside Syria. And when the fighting pretty much came to an end, and that civil war was won by Assad and his Russian and Iranian allies, they situated themselves in the Idlib province in the northwest Syria under the patronage of Turkey and President Erdogan. They used to be funded by the Qataris. Yes, those guys are everywhere. There's good stuff.
Talk about popping up.
Popping up, yeah. Those guys, the Al-Thani family, their fingers and their hands and tentacles are really in all the good things that happen here in the Middle East. But anyhow, I mean, by the way, why is because they are Sunni Salafites. They are Islamists. The Qatar are long-standing funders of Muslim Brotherhood and supporters. I mean, so this kind of fits into that whole narrative of the ideological, but also of, the Qatari strategy of always kind of playing a double, two-faced or two-sided game. But put that aside, that they used to be the big funders. Now it seems that it's Turkey that was supporting them. They were when they were new al-Nusra, they were an offshoot of al-Qaeda, right? That's how al-Nusra got started. These were a bunch of guys who came together, former al-Qaeda fighters. Muhammad Abu al-Jalani, as he's known, the leader of the HTS, is himself somebody who has fought with al-Qaeda in Iraq, made his way to Syria. He is trying to be more pragmatic. Now, it could be that the Qataris sent their Al Jazeera media specialists out there at some point to try to teach these guys how to be a little more media savvy, trim the beard, keep it, clean, look civil, look pragmatic. So they officially in 2016 it seems that they cut off ties with al-Qaeda. They severed that relationship. They're no longer a satellite organization. And they took on this new name. So they did some branding work. Everybody's got to do that at some point, even in the terrorist world. And that's how they became who they became. That's who they are. There's a lot of kind of mythology around al-Jawlani himself, specifically. Unclear where this name comes from, al-Jawlani. There's been some reports that his parents at some point were refugees of the Syrian Golan Heights in the 1967 Six-Day War. Yet to be really verified, but, that could be Jalani, Golani, right?
Let me interject here for a moment, because you may have missed it, but I was reading yesterday in the UK Daily Telegraph a piece written by a man who says he went to university with Jalani. And so he knew him kind of before, during, and after. And he presented him as, a kind of nerdy school kid when he was little. And then the Golan Heights displacement thing came up, refugees, relocated to Saudi Arabia. Professional parents. He became radicalized, apparently, after 5 years in prison in Iraq, in an American prison. And that was where he met all his pals. And that was when he really changed his outlook on the world.
Not a small number of the terrorists that we see around the world come from what could be, a middle-class family. And then somehow, Osama bin Laden's a perfect example, came from a very wealthy family, right? One does not necessarily mean the other, but the question that I think Israelis really are trying to wrap their heads around at the moment is, what do these guys think about Israel? What do they want with Israel? And right now, obviously, they're very hyper-focused on the domestic situation that they are now going to have to deal with in Syria. It's one thing to be a terrorist group with a bunch of, guns and AK-47s and, pickup trucks. It's another thing now to have to run a country, and not a small country, and not a small population. And therefore, the HTS now is going to have to figure out exactly what it's going to do. So I wouldn't necessarily anticipate that Israel is going to be their first target for an attack, but Israel is making the moves that are necessary to mitigate the risk that this new group or changeover in Syria can present us.
So before we get into those moves, a couple of things I just want to, check with you. One is that I don't know if it was Jalani or someone else in the group who said reportedly in an interview with a Channel 11 reporter that made it onto social media, Israel's our friends, we want to work with you, we don't hate you. Did you happen to see that or have any idea as to whether or not that's legit?
There was an interview, I think, that Roe Case might have done on the Khan public broadcaster, where he interviewed someone. I saw a write-up in Yediot Ahronot by Sima Kadmon, also interviewing somebody who was an unnamed rebel who claimed that, we're actually allowed to talk to Israelis. We're not necessarily, Israel's not our enemy. We're not focused on Israel. Again, I think Israel needs to take this all with caution, right? Personally, I had a whole WhatsApp conversation last night, with a friend of mine who is a journalist in the United States, quite senior, about the consequences, ramifications of what's happening here. And I made a very just simple statement of Assad was a terrible human, just a terrible person, murdered together with his father. I don't even know the numbers, but probably upwards of 1 million people that these two have killed in their together 54 years or so of dictatorship and tyranny over Syria. And to say, he would have been better. Now the Islamists, Israel should have found a way to work with him. The world should have been more embracing. All these gymnastic moves that certain people make in the aftermath of the guy who murdered his own people. You're seeing the release. This is just one thing. I forget the name right now of the prison, but the release of some of these people who were stuck in a hole in the ground in this infamous prison in Syria and are coming out and are certain that Hafez Assad, the father who died in 2000, is still the president. They thought that the rebels who rescued them were Saddam Hussein's soldiers. They're stuck in time 30 years ago. They were thrown into a dark hole. These are not good people. We should not be sad that they are now gone. We have to be vigilant. We have to be careful. But there's also something about being on the right side of history. There's morals, there's values, there's principles. It's a good day when bad people are removed from power.
And you could certainly see a lot of happiness on the streets of Syria, and they weren't parsing as we are now who's on first, but that's what we do. So back to kind of what may or may not transpire on the ground. Other statements, again, attributed to the leadership of HTS. And again, I have to make clear to our listeners that it's not that we don't want to kind of, anchor what we're saying in any sources. It's that the sources are so kind of ephemeral in a way. They're on social media. They come and go. They're quick. There's no reliable media on the ground. As you said, maybe Al Jazeera is, but no one that we know of. So there are also reports that HTS leadership is saying, don't damage public infrastructure, for example, like water and electrical facilities, because this belongs to all of us and we need it. We need it to be preserved. So, and there was also not, it seemed, there was a lot of happy shooting, there was a lot of revelry on the streets, but there did not seem to be interpersonal violence in any of the video that I saw and in any of the social media posts. And that's quite extraordinary in kinds of power vacuums for it to just kind of be joyful and peaceful. And yes, you see the people being released from prison. There was, however, in all of this mayhem, a warning that seemed to have been issued directed at Syria's Christian population, which has been decimated over the course of the Assad years. In a country of about 20 million people, the best estimates are that just under 2% of the population is Christian, and they've been warned, we're coming to search your homes. And I mean, at the end of the day, these are Salafists, right? They're fundamentalists. They're Islamists. Any concern about that? Anything that you've heard?
I mean, I'll tell you, I've seen, look, their roots of this group, and I don't want to paint a rosy picture, because there is no rosy picture. These are Islamist radicals, violent people, right? The Nusra group was a terrorist group. The HTS, Ha'yat Tahrir al Sham, they are a terrorist group. They're recognized as a terrorist group. On Jelani's own head, there's a bounty of $10 million in the United States. But at the same time, back in 2013-14, he did distance himself from, or the group distanced itself from ISIS. And they then pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda. They then broke off from al-Qaeda. I've also seen reports of that the rebels have said that Christian worshipers in areas near Aleppo, where there is a Christian population, they have said they would respect their freedom of religion. I don't know. There's conflicting. There's a lot of reports that are coming out. What is true, what is not, we don't know. What's happening in Idlib, apparently they've allowed somewhat of Christian prayer, but they've also imposed Sharia law. What exactly this all means, I think we have to wait to see. I think we also have to recognize is that the ability to manipulate reality is limited to some extent, right? This is a new era. Syria is going to be a new country. And our interest at the end of the day, the Israeli interest, if you can really boil it down, would obviously be to have a Western, liberal, progressive nation to our north, but that's not in the cards right now. Then what I think the second best for us is going to be a country that is stable, that has a clear rule of law and government that you can hold accountable, not a country that is fractured and splintered and everybody who can get their hands on weapons and rockets and missiles. And you can not necessarily engage with that country, but you can create a balance of power with that country where they understand the rules of engagement. You understand the rules of engagement. They fear you. In our case, we want them to fear us. And that's it. And of course, be vigilant, but that would be not a bad scenario for Israel.
Would be a great outcome. And, to your point, I think that there's this rush to proclaim and adjudicate and declare about what this is going to be to the north of Israel, this new country. And what jumps out at me, and you just talked about a bit, was the fact that we have so many competing rebel groups. And that's going to be the HTS test, is if they're able to kind of develop some sort of order.
Don't forget, we also have the Kurds, the Syrian National Army, right, which are backed mostly by, There they have the Syrian National Army. There's also the YPG. They receive American support. There's alleged ties with Israel. You have the Druze, which we also happen to know. You still have the Alawites. You have the Russians that are still in Syria on the coast. They haven't given up their naval bases of Tartus and Latakia. You have now the HTS funded and supported by Turkey. So now we have Erdogan effectively with something of a presence in Syria at the moment. So you're going to have a lot of power players inside Turkey and for the foreseeable future, which really will mean a necessity for Israel at least, to maneuver very carefully and to try to reach some sort of deterrence with whoever is there in charge. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, are attempts to kind of bolster that deterrence. But at the end of the day, you're not going to have a single address necessarily for issues that might arise. It's not going to be very quickly a stable country.
I just want to point out for our listeners, we had a pretty thorough discussion about the various parties, and in particular the Kurds, last week when I spoke with Jonathan Conricus on this podcast. But there are about 23 million Kurds. There are more Kurds in this very large swath of land that borders on Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, but it's a very large territory. The Kurds have been fighting forever for some kind of national home territory, sovereign territory, and they are in the north of Syria, which is also where ISIS is located, and not to be underestimated. Reports, again, of ISIS taking advantage of the instability and expanding the territory that they control. And there are also concerns, of course, that these open-air prisons that the Kurds control, in which tens of thousands of former ISIS sit in the desert, that they may be freed. So there's a lot going on, a lot that we don't know. And let's say it's fluid and volatile. But there's also a lot that Israel has been busy the last few days. And then there's a lot that Israel has been doing in order to, as you say, try to impose some order in the areas which we feel we may impose a limited degree of control. One of those areas is the buffer zone.
We're just a little under halfway through this podcast, with really sharp analysis to come. To paying subscribers of State of Tel Aviv, thank you for your support, without which we could not produce the content we do. And I apologize for interrupting in this way, but it is important to impress upon others who are regular listeners and clearly derive value from our work to please consider supporting us with a paid subscription. We are living in a moment that is beyond critical for Israel, but also for Western civilization. Legacy media is not providing the information you want and need. State of Tel Aviv is. Now, back to Yaakov, who gets into the detail of what Israel is doing to manage the swift change in Syria and how it may impact this very small, besieged country.
Israel, I think, is working on 3 different tracks at the moment. There's track 1, which is eliminate strategic threats from presenting themselves in the future. And what do I mean by that? We've seen bombings, lots of bombings over the last 48 hours in particular, against suspected sites that held chemical weapons. Most of the chemical weapons were supposed to have been removed, as we all recall, back in the summer and fall of 2013. And the deal that was brokered at the time by Russia and the United States during the Obama administration, when Assad used chemical weapons against his country, against his people, America was threatening military action. Assad, they reached a deal that they would remove. So most of it was removed. Some did remain. And Israel has been eliminating, it seems, destroying that to be able to prevent it from falling into the hands of any of these radical forces. That includes the chemical weapons, it includes air defense systems, and it includes long-range strategic weapons like ballistic missiles, Scuds, and others. So Israel is trying to eliminate those capabilities. The second track that Israel is working on is in the buffer zone in particular, in taking up positions there, in moving in some forces. And basically, I think, what is the buffer zone, by the way, just as a point of reference for our listeners? The after the 1973 Yom Kippur War in 1974, there was a UN decision and the establishment of a force called UNDOF, the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force. I love these acronyms. UNDOF was established inside Syria, basically, along the Golan Heights. By the way, I'm laughing at the moment because I'm going back 15 years in time. One day I drove up to the Golan Heights and met the commander of UNDOF. I think his first name was Wolfgang, a good Austrian guy, comes to the meeting decked out in quite the uniform, perfectly pressed, and a little poodle, like out of a movie, like what you would expect to see an Austrian military general carrying like a little poodle with him. It was like surreal. But anyhow, very different than the way our military operates. But UNDOF was basically there to create a demilitarized zone mostly on the Syrian side, but all military forces that were built up, whether put into that area by Syria or by Israel, were counted. That include tanks, soldiers, artillery cannons, etc., all under a certain limit. The buffer zone is meant to be demilitarized. Israel moving in there is basically sending a message to whoever now is taking over Syria. Listen, guys, do what you want inside Syria. Don't come near us. You start to put forces along our border, we're not going to tolerate that. It's a good preemptive move. It's smart. It's meant to send a very clear message to people on the other side. Don't mess with the state of Israel. The third track of all of this is obviously going to be the diplomatic track, and that includes working with the three superpowers that are now inside Syria. America, which is still on the east, Russia, which is on the west, and Turkey, which now has representation throughout most of the country. Israel needs to maneuver with all three of these different superpowers, and it's about reaching agreements and understandings of what's going to happen. We can't sugarcoat the fact that Turkey is no friend of ours, right? And Erdogan is not at all a supporter or friend to this country. But he is a member of NATO, and that does create some sort of balance that he'll have to navigate. So Israel's going to have to figure this stuff out as it moves along.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but when you refer to the three superpowers, of course, America and Russia are superpowers by a different definition. Turkey and Erdogan are regional superpowers. They are not global superpowers in the same league. With respect to, I just have to add a little tidbit of my own to your UNDOF reminiscence. When I was serving as ambassador, and I'm pretty sure that this was during 2015, and I went up to that buffer zone, and there were UNDOF troops, of course, deployed in the zone, and many of them at the time were Canadian. So Canadian ambassador, I go up, curious and interested, of course, to see what's going on there and to meet with our troops. And it was extraordinary, the total opposite of what you're describing. These are guys, many of the people who volunteered for these tours of duty, they're paid extremely well for short periods of time. And they lived in really primitive conditions, literally like a kind of hut dug into the side of the hill, made of stone. But more importantly, they were separated by maybe 100 meters, a kilometer from where the jihadists were operating at that time in southern Syria. And so they wanted to show me, and I remember them taking me out, pointing to a hill, just a bare, nothing pimple in the land. And they said, that hill, there have been so many lives lost over that hill. It was a focus of a battle between the Syrian army and the jihadists, the ISIS guys, for months. Finally, ISIS took control. It was bare. There was nothing. They said here, and they gave me their super, binoculars to look through to see this hill. Nothing. Maybe one tree on the top. Within 30 seconds, no exaggeration, there were dozens of fighters who had come up from something underground and were just kind of standing in a cluster, and they had their binoculars and cameras, and they were looking at us, looking at them. Wow. And the guys said, put it down. Let's, basically take cover, because they get really antsy when they notice us looking at them. And the black flag was up, the ISIS flag. I mean, that was kind of one moment that really drove home to me just how close things get here and how quickly they can change. The buffer zone, just before we move on, that you were talking about, Israel yesterday took control of the Syrian side of Mount Hermon.
Yes.
Tallest peak in the area.
No, by the way, the Hermon, thank you for pointing that out, is mostly, again, this is symbolism, right? This is a high peak of a mountain. It was taken over by Shaldag special commando forces from the Air Force. It's actually funny because there's a unit in the Army, which they would do, the PR teams in the IDF would have us do these articles about called the Alpinistim. It's a group of reservists who are trained to operate in the snow and fight on skis, kind of like a James Bond movie. They have one job, which is the Hermon. But when it came to conquering now the Hermon, they sent Shaldag. Like, not even these guys. Like, what you guys had you were there for one reason. But anyhow, it's the symbolism. It's taking up high ground. It's taking up a position. We've done this before, by the way. We did this back in 2012, 2013. We've done this before of moving into the areas when there seems to be disarray or chaos in Syria. So it's not the first time that we've done this, but I wouldn't necessarily think that we're going to be there permanently also. It's about stabilizing and watching and waiting and making sure that message does get across. But the Hermon is obviously important. This was where there were some severe fights back in the Yom Kippur War in 1973.
Plus, it's tall, it's cold, there's a lot of snow up there, and we know that Middle Easterners, don't like fighting in the winter. But just to be clear, too, you referred earlier to the Alpinistim, which may not come out so clearly to people who don't speak Hebrew. It's basically alpinists, and that's how it transliterates into Hebrew. And it's the Alpine unit, which has a wonderful story that maybe we'll tell some other time. But I think we've given a nice overview. We seem to have a ceasefire that's more or less holding in the north, and Israelis are beginning to return to their homes there. And then the big question, of course, we zoom out a little further, and it becomes, what does all this mean for Iran in the region? How does this impact on Iran's power, perceived power and actual power in the region?
I mean, I think that there's no doubt to an extent that what happened here, the rebels took advantage of a situation that they identified, Iran being very weak, Hezbollah no longer capable of coming to fight alongside Assad, which is what happened in the first iteration of the civil war. Hezbollah sent thousands of soldiers of its own to help prop up Assad. Iran sent its own military advisors, equipment, and troops, also Shia militias from all over the region to help fight for Assad. And of course, Russia. The rebels identified a window where they saw, one second, Hezbollah gone, Hamas not really relevant, but gone to a large extent, or not capable, and Hezbollah not gone, but decimated, not capable of fighting alongside Assad. Iran exposed, vulnerable, weak after the Israeli attack in October, not able to supply and give the same level of assistance that it once was able to give. And therefore, this was a moment to barrel through Syria and try to take over large swaths of land. They succeeded. So this is a result to a large extent of what has happened here in our little sandbox over the last 14 months. The question really going forward is going to be, okay, this is interesting, right? We've managed to redefine or recreate the Middle East to some extent, but what really in the end will this do to the Iranians? And I think that if we look at it for a moment, there is a strategic opportunity, and it's one that Israel has to be very thoughtful about, and that is, if Iran has long been the great threat to Israel, and particularly the nuclear file, and we saw just a few days ago, Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the IAEA, came out with a statement after his most recent visit there saying they have quadrupled the amount of uranium that they've enriched to over 60%, putting them that you need over 90% for military grade uranium, but they're now just, if they decide, days away from the 90%. Weapons program a little different, but they're plowing ahead. And if this is the great threat that we think it potentially has the ability to become, is now not the moment to finally take it on. And I say that because there were really two reasons why we've held back, I think, or maybe three, but two primarily militarily that we've held back from attacking Iran until now. The first was we weren't sure, or there was a lot of skepticism that we could do it, that we could make it to Iran, that we could overcome the air defense systems, that we could take out targets. Well, we've done that already. We've operated with dozens of aircraft over Iran. We've taken out their air defense systems. They now are exposed and vulnerable in a way they were not before. This does not yet mean that we can penetrate all their underground fortified nuclear installations. That's another element. But let's assume for a moment that we can do enough damage to set back the program indefinitely. So now you can do that. The other reason not to attack was, what about the cost, the price you would pay in terms of the missile barrages that would be unleashed on your country from Hezbollah, from Hamas, from Assad in Syria, and from Iran itself? Well, now we know Hamas can't fire at us. Hezbollah might be able to, but nothing that really is a big threat against us. Assad gone. And even Iran, we've been hit by the birdie with 500, 600 of their, missiles and drones, and we're okay. So at the end of the day, when you calculate and you consider these two things, you say to yourself, hold on, maybe there is a moment now with Iran isolated, weak, and vulnerable like never before, that you do something. Now, that's got to be on people's minds right now.
Absolutely. And I'm certain it was on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's mind when he showed up at the northern border yesterday looking quite pleased.
The BB system works simple. Everything good is because of him. Everything bad is because of someone else.
The supply lines to Hezbollah, which ran from Iran, can we assume that those are going to be disrupted significantly now? The HTS and other rebels in Syria, are they friends or foes of Hezbollah?
So you have a situation that they've had a land bridge to Hezbollah from within Syria in an area near the city of Homs, which is kind of to the north or central Syria on the western side. The land bridge was basically, it was like an Iranian land corridor almost that they were able to use that would bring weapons from Iran, sometimes through Iraq, into Syria. That's why you've had the American presence on the east. They would travel across Syria and make their way into Syria and then to Hezbollah in Lebanon. For the time being, with the rebels in control of those areas, we can assume that they are going to have difficulty rearming Hezbollah. We also know that Israel is being very watchful and vigilant for a long time now and is taking preemptive action when it sees things that are happening. Obviously, you have to assume that you won't be able to see everything, but I think we could say for the time being, it's going to be harder for Iran to replenish Hezbollah stockpiles. Where I say a word of caution is when I hear people say to me, these guys are Sunnis, they're Salafites, they're not in bed with the Iranians, they're the Shias, they're against, yes, we've heard this before, but the Iranians find ways to get along with even the Sunnis, right? I mean, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, these aren't exactly Shia, and they've been allies for a long time. So I don't necessarily accept that idea that because of the Islamic ideological religious divide, we're going to be safe. No. Guys, usually because of the Islamic religious ideological divide, we are not safe, right? That's usually what ends up happening.
I think that's been disproven over and over again.
But by the way, I'm hearing this from people. But I would just say is that over time, the Iranians are skilled at making these alliances, even with the other so-called Islamic side of the bed. So they know how to overcome those differences when it pertains to us.
So I want to, in our last few minutes, Yaakov, focus on the possibility that the Trump effect is in and part of all of what we see going on around us. And more to the point, we're going to talk about that by focusing on what seems to be a changing situation with respect to the hostages who are held in the Gaza Strip by Hamas and others. As we know, they are in horrific condition, and they're held in horrific conditions, and there's real concern that they will not survive much longer in that captivity. There seems to be a push. President-elect Trump came out from day one and said, BB, everybody, you get those hostages out or you're all going to have hell to pay for. I think his harshest criticism was directed towards the Arab countries in the region, in particular Egypt and Qatar. And lo and behold, over the last week or so, we see Qatar is now inviting Hamas leaders to return to Doha to reside there at the Qataris' pleasure for a period of time. That Qatar has said, yes, we'll step back up to the table and mediate. Turkey's getting involved. Egypt's getting involved. And then there are reports from the Gaza Strip that Hamas is out there saying, tell us who you got. So to all of their, Hamas knows who they hold, but Palestinian Islamic Jihad and anyone else out there who may be holding hostages dead or alive, tell us who you've got, what their names are, and what their condition is. And it suggests that there may actually be an opportunity or some momentum to finally get those people out. What do you think?
I do think, like you said, that there is the effect of the Trump effect, right? And that is having significant impact on everything that's taking place in the Middle East right now. I think that's what played into the decision by the Iranians to rein in Hezbollah and agree to a ceasefire. Iran fearful of what might come and therefore making overtures to the incoming Trump administration that we want to play ball, we want to be nice, etc. The Iranians are masters at that. I think that now, after Trump's comments just a few days ago on Twitter or X about hell breaking loose and the sorts of what will happen if a hostage deal is not released, this is definitely giving pause to the leaders of Hamas and probably to the leaders of Qatar and to the leaders of Iran, right, which kind of pull the strings behind the scenes. This might be what's also making a deal possible. I think that also Israel is coming around to some extent. And I want to hope that the prime minister, and from what I hear, he had a meeting yesterday with hostage families. And in that meeting, he was quite open in discussing the option of a deal that's on the table and the optimism that at least he has that a multi-stage deal might be possible very soon. There are reports now of lists that are being sent back and forth there's now 100 hostages who are in Gaza after one of the bodies of a hostage was recovered last week. We've seen a number of videos in the last week and a half. Idan Alexander, about a week and a half ago. And now a video on Saturday night of Matan Zankauker was released by Hamas, that video, first sign of life. And he did not look good. I've seen and heard reports, I'm sure as you have, Vivian, of how he looks emaciated, dry lips, the sorts. I mean, you said it. They're not doing well in these terror dungeons that they're being held in. Out of the 100, how many are alive? How many are dead? The numbers constantly, are up in the air, but it seems that there's a significant number that we can potentially go in and get. And this has to be something that Israel needs to do. So we have to hope that the combination, Trump, of what's happening now in Syria, Iran, the collapse of this Iranian axis and power in the region is having its effect also on the leaders of Hamas who are capable of making a deal. I hope it's also having an effect on our leaders because we need a government that can make a deal and pass it through the cabinet. It's going to come at a price that we can't, by the way, we can't write off the price. We could talk about whether it's right or wrong, but Israel will have to agree to ceasefire. Israel will have to pull out, if not all its forces, most of its forces. Israel will have to stop its attacks on Hamas. It will have to stop its military operations, which will give Hamas 60 days at least, if not more, to get up and rebuild and come out. Israel will have to potentially commit to other obligations, such as what is going to the day after Gaza look like, and what will be this committee made up of Americans and Palestinians and who knows what, and how will that work? So and it's going to have to release prisoners. So, and we've seen what happens when we release prisoners. Yahya Sinwar was a prisoner released in a prisoner swap back in 2011. So we can't diminish from what that is, but I think that you and I at least agree that the time has come for this to happen. Right. And it's overtime.
Way over time. And the other minor detail that you did not mention is that if such an agreement is reached, the government has to find some way to stay together, which means that Benjamin Netanyahu has to manage the extreme right-wing power base that he created and cultivated, which is Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, among others.
I'm going to give him the credit that he will figure that out. If Bibi is good at anything, it is that ability to maneuver within his coalition. And by the way, we just spoke about the Trump effect. There's the Trump effect here as well. And I think that Netanyahu will skillfully use the Trump card in his maneuvering with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir to explain to them, we need to do this deal now, get back the hostages, end the war, so-called, to give that to Donald Trump so we can get from Donald Trump annexation of some parts of the West Bank, Saudi deal, or just not to be mean to us, who knows what. But Netanyahu is smart when it comes to these types of things.
He's a slam dunk on that kind of situation and never lets us down.
No, not on this stuff.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive analysis and rundown of what is nothing other than a bag of snakes. I mean, I've been immersed in this world now for 11 years. You've been immersed in the place for much longer. And everyone I speak with says they've never quite seen it so complex, dynamic, shall we say, and it just doesn't stop.
Yeah, but I will just say, if we wanted to do the very short version of this podcast, there's a very quick answer to what's happening right now. Like everything else in Israel, there are risks and there are opportunities.
On that note, I think we'll wrap up for the day. Have a wonderful week.
You too.
Talk soon.
I'm jamming this podcast out ASAP before another country rises or falls. The intensity of the pace in Israel and the region is wild and shows no signs of abating. As always, thanks for being here, and please take a moment to rate us on Spotify or on whatever platform you listen to State of Tel Aviv. The public support makes a difference in how many people can access our work with ease. And I'd love to hear from you on our site, so like it, comment, engage. I will make the request of all those who are here every time we publish a new episode. If you haven't already, please consider supporting our efforts in this really critical time with a paid subscription. Nothing good in life is free, not even podcasts. If you listen to the end, then you value our work, and we value your time. A cup of coffee once a month is all it takes, and it makes a big difference to what we can do. Follow us on Twitter at State of TLV, on Instagram at State of Tel Aviv. And that's it for today. Talk to you soon. Thanks for tuning in. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager, who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.